Hello and welcome to the first session of Beyond Price and Profit with Victoria Ivanova. I'm going to pass it off to her now.
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining. And yeah, so I think I'm going to start this class by first of all introducing myself. Then I'll ask you guys to introduce yourselves and also to tell me kind of what interests you about this class and maybe something about your practice that you're trying to figure out and that may be relevant to what you may think this course is about. Then I'll do kind of a lecture or sort of just basically set up the framework for the course. For those of you who did the previous course with me will be familiar with it. So I'll just basically set out the parameters, which will then kind of start working out throughout the consequent sessions. And then we'll have a Q&A. So the Q&A can be ultimately kind of anything in relationship to the things that I've said in the presentation, but also by all means do interrupt me during the presentation. And also in relationship to the text that I have assigned for this session, which was a text that I wrote for an issue of Art and Finance called Contemporary Art and Financialization: Two Approaches, and another text, if I may call it as such, basically the Deloitte Art and Tactic Report 2016, kind of on the art market, but also just on the way that the financial sector thinks about the art market today. Right, so in terms of introducing myself, I am a curator, researcher, and writer. I've got, my background is actually in terms of kind of academic background. My academic background is sort of in modern political philosophy and sociology of law. So I think that kind of explains a lot why I approach art the way I do. Although maybe not entirely, but I think actually what does kind of explain my approach to art more than anything is the fact that before coming into the art field, I worked in human rights. So I guess I have kind of quite a systemic approach to various fields that I could have made of various codes, protocols, norms, etc. So I think that's a way that isn't really typical in approaching the art field, because the art field generally tends to be primarily, especially the contemporary art field, tends to be primarily perceived through the prism of artistic production, artistic practice, or autonomy of art, let's say, if you follow within that kind of modernist legacy, and obviously art objects. So those people who kind of were with me in the previous course will know that kind of my approach to contemporary art is very much from a position of understanding it as a system, understanding how that system is integrated into other systems, which order kind of societal norms, but also which sort of are responsible for mediating certain kind of ideological positions and certain mechanisms of contemporary life and order. So that's kind of my background. I guess what another thing that's important to know about me is that I'm currently doing my PhD at Goldsmiths, and my PhD is kind of the PhD question is how are new digital platforms basically transforming the notions of value and exchange in contemporary art, and how should these transformations be incorporated into art theory. And I guess what's really interesting to me, ultimately, within this sort of new, maybe not even so new, and I guess that's my argument, transition towards kind of digital mediation of all forms of practices and activities within the art field, is the kind of collapse that happens of kind of practice, dissemination, valuation of economic valuation, social evaluation, aesthetic valuation, and how that sort of is ultimately telling us that we need to understand how value and exchange operate and how they're interdependent within the contemporary art field. We need to re-theorize it. And the re-theorization is very much also based on the idea that in order to do this kind of re-theorization of the current moment, we also need to look back. We need to look back and actually reassess the ontological premises upon which today's paradigm of contemporary art is founded. And in order to do that, we need to actually look kind of further back into history and to understand what historical trajectory has actually led to contemporary art as the art paradigm du jour. And I guess within my thesis, my proposal is to consider the evolution that has led us to contemporary art from the position of instrumentality, from the position of instrumental techne, rather than from the position of autonomy and poiesis. And so basically the whole thesis kind of rereading the history of arts through through the prism of instrumentality. Now, the research in finance is really important because I think that it actually allows for these kind of different ontological terms to become more apparent. And I guess that I will explain in the course of my later presentation today. So for now, I think let's just introduce ourselves. Please tell me your name, why you're interested in this course, how it relates to your work. And also, I think just in a very kind of pragmatic, practical note, tell me whether you're kind of auditing this course, whether you're thinking of, just Christelle just told me that she's thinking of, she's not sure whether she can do it. So it'd be quite useful to know these details, and also whether you want to produce some sort of output, whether it's written or presentation. I guess the two kind of options that I can give you is that you can do a written piece, and I can look at it, I can give you feedback, you can present it, or you can do a more sort of easygoing presentation during one of the sessions in response to one of the topics that we cover, and perhaps even be a direct respondent to the people that I have invited in and whom I will introduce at the end of the session. So these are the kind of the various terms for assessment, or not assessment, but just kind of coursework, I guess. And then the third thing I wanted to ask you about is in the last session, the last course, I have offered a 30-minute kind of one-to-one tutorial separate from the actual sessions. So if you guys are interested in that, let me know and we can schedule one by email. So yeah, let's start with Christopher. Could you please introduce yourself?
Okay. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My name is Christopher Dorn. I have an academic background in religious studies and philosophy. For the last several years, I've been a student of the financial markets. I think I explained this in a prior class. My dad retired when he was very young. I think he was 50, and he decided that he'd manage his own financial assets. He had 2 or 3 friends who were portfolio managers, and so he knew the world of finance. And I guess through a series of conversations, I became interested also in it, even though that's not really the direction that my own life went. In any case, I've approached financial markets from the perspective of both a critic of economic, social, and cultural trends, as well as a practitioner. I have 2 or 3 electronic trading platforms, and I monitor financial and currency markets on a regular basis. Academically, I would say that I'm interested in, if we talk about bigger themes, I'd say that I'm interested in how we've undergone this transition from an industrialized economy to a financialized one, and what that entails for life, for social ethics. I was reading the introduction to that text, The Sociology of Finance, which looks interesting in that respect.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think this is, we're going to touch on this a lot. And I guess one thing I should have said in the very beginning is that I'm not an economist. So I think it's also very important to understand that I'm coming to the topic of kind of finance as a complete novice. I started this research in 2012. Although I have some sort of background in economics, but like in the kind of way that probably most people have, in the kind of neoclassical macro and microeconomics that we're usually taught either in the final years of school or kind of first years of university, if you're doing disciplines that are sort of related to some kind of systemic assessment of political and politico-economic systems. So so I guess I would be very much willing to kind of also to draw on other people's expertise in the subject area, and I think it's sort of it's important to kind of for me, this is a very kind of important political moment where something that has been kept quite alien, from the humanities and from, let's say, just everyday social understanding of life, that basically has become so impenetrable as an object towards which we can attach language and kind of ordinary understanding. It's very important for me to find actually ways of understanding that entity being huge, very complex system of finance, and to sort of to kind of domesticate it, to kind of subject it to everyday understanding, and in order to then to rework it. And I guess this kind of reworking aspect of what actually art offers is ultimately a really important political dimension to the whole process, why I'm interested in finance in general. So this is just to say that yeah, I'd be very curious kind of to draw on your more kind of practical knowledge, sort of very sort of yeah, practice-based knowledge of how financial currency markets operate. So please interrupt me at any point if you want to sort of nuance something that I'm saying, if you feel that I might be in the wrong, etc. That would be totally fantastic. Okay, so now we have Christelle, and you've briefly introduced yourself, but if there's any, anything else that you would like to add. Actually, yeah, it'd be great. Actually, no, do introduce yourself again, because before we weren't being, we're not being broadcast, filmed, etc. So yeah, watch.
Right. So hi, I'm Christelle. I'm hopefully going to be able to take your course. I'm an artist. I'm based in Estonia, and I guess the reasons why I'm very much interested in your approach, there are several. One is here in Estonia, I find myself being constantly sort of confused in terms of, like, most of the stuff that I look at and think about has something to do with contemporary art, yet I find that it's very hard to place where I am geographically and sort of politically and historically in the contemporary art context. It's kind of contemporary art just sort of doesn't seem to make sense here on some level. I don't know if that's completely bonkers to say. The other reason is that much more than you, on a very sort of amateurish or just kind of everyday person's level, I'm kind of fascinated with finance, and in a way, finance and art more and more seem to converge in interesting places. And yeah, the third thing that I talked about together with my partner and a bunch of other people, we are about to launch a pension fund manager that is going to manage obligatory pension funds here in Estonia, and that has been founded based on sort of people's enthusiasm and kind of interest to take their savings back from the banks. So people have chipped in, put money together to start their own pension funds. And this on many levels seems like a no-brainer in the current technological possibilities, and yet there doesn't seem to be any other similar enterprise in the whole world, or at least we haven't found any. So and again, doing that and being very close to sort of this kind of entrepreneurial culture, because of this, it's again opened up different ways in which culture is, or this kind of entrepreneurial culture again feeds back into what I think about in the context of my own art practice or art in a wider sense. So yeah, in that very vague.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about this, because I guess this kind of the way that you're sort of thinking about the kind of almost like this coextensive elements of coextensive logics of financialized economies and the kind of subjects that they demand, and the sort of contemporarization of the global art field, right? It's like they're very, the resonances are very clear, and actually it's the resonances between them that really interest me, because I think at least within the sort of critical discourses of cities like New York, London, Berlin, and I think many other places, this sort of resonances scare people in the art field, and I think the dominant approach is actually to be very critical towards them. I think in part because of what it actually kind of reveals about contemporary art, and the fact that we need to requalify what an emancipatory political project actually means if we take these resonances seriously. And I guess my kind of project is very much about, you know, taking that step forward and thinking, okay, if we actually accept these resonances, how do we start recognizing them, and what language do we form around them? What kind of practices do we derive from them? And how can these practices then be not only ways of, let's say, giving language to finance or representing finance, but how can they also be means of modulating finance? So how can the art field then become an experimental platform for alternative financial logics? And of course, that has its loads of limitations. I mean, this is a very kind of wide brush approach. But I think as a sort of starting position, ontological starting position, it's a very important move to make. And I guess this course is very much about highlighting the practices which are making that move, and also looking at historical precedents which have made that move, because I think we can always kind of unearth archives which point to a different narrative, and I think the narrative that we have inherited within the global contemporary art complex is a very particular one, and yeah, I will speak about that later. But yeah, it's great to have us and to have us as well. But it would be fantastic if you find the strength to stay up and join us for the other sessions as well. So, okay, Maria, hi.
Hi. So I'm in art, like through and through. My background is art practice, like studio based. Like I started out in like painting, then I transferred to like new media, video, installation. Then I ended up in sculpture. So I've been kind of like going through different mediums and always kind of, I don't know, have always been involved in art. I've always had the kind of orientation towards it. And so I'm coming to this with kind of my own problems in relation to what I feel are like the limits of art. And like, I feel like the last 4 sessions, like the last classes have brought up like a lot of questions for me, even though, I mean, I feel like I'm only like now starting to articulate my sort of questions, and I feel like a lot of conflicts, especially maybe I think it has a lot to do with like coming from like a practice that never had like an explicit political orientation, but now I'm kind of coming into like a knowing, or like more like of an awareness of the implications of contemporary art, and like that's just been kind of just putting all kinds of conflicts in terms of practice, and I feel very confused. And I'm hoping to, and especially like in terms of last class we had, I didn't do my last project, and I feel like I've been kind of struggling to actually like put something together, because this means like a lot to me in terms of practice. Like, but I feel like this session I'm going to do something, and I feel like I'm going to figure it out. So I'm really excited.
Yes.
keep going, right?
Well, it looks like we'll have plenty of opportunity to figure things out because it's just the four of us for now.
I know, I guess so.
So, as opposed to some of the former sessions, where there were like, 10 or whatever, 12 people, where it's actually very difficult to have a conversation. I think it's easier to have a conversation. I guess one of the things I find a little bit confusing about this online format is like, I always thought that I'm like a systems person who's into like abstracting oneself from body, but actually I found this at times a little bit challenging, because I think there's something about being in the same room and about reading people's body languages and responding to each other that is a little bit lost here. So, and I need to keep on looking at the sidebar all the time, and I always forget. But yeah, Christopher, you have a question.
Yeah, I don't know if this will help Crystal at all, but the course, the course, I'm sorry, what's your name again? The one who last spoke.
Maria.
Yeah, the course to which Maria referred was, I'm saying this for Crystal's sake, was art and human rights, right? I don't know if that was the exact title. Contemporary art and human rights. Thematically, are you going to make any links between that course, the content of that course, and what we hope to do in this course?
Yes, absolutely. Because for me, they're very continuous, and it's sort of, and in a sense, it's almost like writing my autobiography, which is a little bit sycophantic, and like, why do you have to pay to be part of this? But it's also kind of looking how my thinking has evolved in terms of, what are the relevant systems to look at if we are interested in sort of globally ambitious logics of ordering, and what aspects of the system do we need to understand? How do we need to understand how the relationships between each other, what are the relevant ideological projects, and I guess I should have mentioned in the previous course the fact that I've got background in modern political philosophy, but I think that's really important. I think that's why all of this, like that kind of obsession with the liberal tradition, but simultaneously this kind of social contract tradition is very important. And the contract for me is actually that thing that ties all of this together. So it's, it's whether it's human rights, whether it's the sort of modulation on the contract form that's performed through contemporary art, or the kind of the contract based form of the derivative, which is the kind of part of the financial ecology that's most interesting to me philosophically, and sort of as a framework to really kind of get to grips with in order to understand our contemporary condition. So, and as to quote a really good friend of mine, Kathleen Ditzig, she recently came up with this great line about saying that actually, the contract form is the only leverage that we have in sort of in not even resisting, but in kind of delimiting just a destructive capitalism ultimately. So kind of the contract form becomes simultaneously something that's very basic to contract law, to the liberal tradition, to capitalism, but it also is the very thing that, if you're on the wrong side of power, that ultimately kind of allows you to have some sort of leverage, some sort of like conversational possibility with systems of power. So yes, I will draw from the previous course. I think methodologically, it's basically the same methodology ultimately. So I guess for you guys, a lot of things will make sense. And yeah, so I guess maybe this is a good point to start the actual presentation. So I will share. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I think I've started contextualizing this course a little bit already. And as I said, sort of what's very kind of fundamental to the way that I'll be approaching the question of value in relationship to contemporary art and financialization is understanding contemporary art as a system. I guess this kind of resonates very much with certain sociological approaches to contemporary art, and we looked at one of them in the previous course. This was kind of Nicholas Luhmann's Art as a Social System. But I guess Luhmann is not really the kind of he's not really the most kind of go-to figure within the field of art in order to understand art from a sociological perspective. Much more than Luhmann, I guess it's Pierre Bourdieu who will look at in order to kind of get a grasp of what a sociological approach to art could mean. And there's certainly a lot that I take from Bourdieu, but I think at the same time, because ultimately Bourdieu's approach it's sociological. I guess I'm interested in sort of understanding contemporary art as a system, but not just from a sociological position, but also from an ontological position. So that's where kind of the difference probably resides. Yet at the same time, I think what's really useful about Bourdieu's work is how he kind of brings the infrastructural, the institutional, or the social institutional dimension of any social system, including art and contemporary art in particular, to the fore of his analysis. So for me, this kind of move is very important in the field of contemporary art, because I think if we look at the way that contemporary art frames itself, and I guess the only way that we can really look at that is through the discourses that circulate around contemporary art, whether they're produced by institutions or by curators or even by artists themselves, and by critics. I always forget the critics, but I guess the critic is a really funny role within I'll come to that role a bit later within the field of contemporary art. I mean, the discourse is very much always about the artwork and about the practice. And so this kind of association of contemporary art with system is not particularly useful. So, well, I think it's useful for those who ultimately are kind of the main benefactors of a contemporary art regime. I don't think it's useful if we want to actually either reform or kind of understand the system from a different perspective. And I guess what this kind of separation between the infrastructural dimension of contemporary art and the sort of artwork, art practice dimension of art does is that it creates what I call a value schism. So on the one hand, you have the kind of aesthetic value, ethico-political value, cultural value that is usually attached to contemporary art as artworks, as art practices, as a particular kind of art paradigm. And then on the other hand, you have sort of all the kind of back-end stuff, which is the economic value, most significantly, that sits kind of uncomfortably in the background, in the shadow, but never is really fully admitted as something as co-constitutive of what value of contemporary art is. I guess that kind of value schism is what I am kind of trying to resolve by rereading the ontology of contemporary art from a position of a system, and kind of using ultimately sort of financialization as a particular aspect of financialization as a foil that helps me to read art as a system. So then the interest in financialization is, it's a little bit opportunistic, as many things are in contemporary art. So in 2012, when I kind of started working on my MA dissertation, I just thought, okay, so I've kind of done human rights. I'm not really interested in looking at that at that particular point in time. I have this kind of luxury of dedicating a lot of research time to a very specific topic. Let's go into something new. Oh, I'm in upstate New York, and what could be better than to actually explore financialization, given that we are kind of supposedly going through kind of the rebooting of the global financial system after the kind of 2008-2009 meltdown, and to actually try to understand what's happening there. And I think that, that opportunism was, I wouldn't say it was prevalent within the contemporary art field, but there were quite a lot of people, quite a lot of kind of significant, famous contemporary art people who were interested in that. In particular, I think it'd be worth mentioning Maria Lind, the Swedish curator, who I think is still, or maybe was at that time, head curator or director of is it Tenstakonsthall or something like that in Sweden. But anyhow, she had this sort of tripartite, I think it was tripartite project that explored finance and art through the prism of abstraction. Abstraction kind of being the operative mechanism that sort of ties both financial systems and certain dimensions of art, and sort of looking at these resonances, but simultaneously looking at the art market. And in a sense, it was basically her kind of trying to feel this territory, which has not yet really been explored in great detail. Because if you want to understand contemporary art market, you don't really go to contemporary art discourse. Nobody within the contemporary art discourse, at least at that point, was kind of seriously dealing with the market as like an intellectual subject in and of itself. So you had certain people like, let's say, Noah Horowitz, who I think is the director of something of Armory Show, the big art fair in New York, and he wrote quite a good book called Art of the Deal. But that was more kind of journalistic type of analysis rather than like really sort of an intellectually, academically, and kind of discursively first class type of thing that, this is the way that kind of discourses get ranked within contemporary art. Then you also had Elizabeth Graff's work, and I think her work is quite important to me because I think like in terms of just methodology, we stand quite close to each other. But I think they're important also deviations because we have ultimately slightly different stakes. So her book that I have in mind is called High Price. Is it High Price? I'll look it up afterwards. Yeah, it is High Price, right? So, so these were kind of the works that were the sort of the inroads that were being made into the field. But I guess what was really interesting to me is that despite this kind of evident and slightly kind of easy and maybe all too easy mirroring of abstraction in finance and abstraction in art, right? There was still this sort of syndrome of othering the economic dimension when it came to understanding what that abstraction actually means for the art field. And what I got interested is actually in trying to figure out whether it's possible to move away from this othering of the economic sphere and to actually start reading it in a more sort of, start reading the contemporary art field in a way that doesn't isolate, that doesn't alienate the economic, but that actually kind of fully acknowledges it as a co-constitutive element of what contemporary art is, right, in this sort of deep ontological sense of the word is. So that was the kind of the second contextual parameter that would be good to know. And I think the third is what is kind of commonly known as deflation of critique as a mode of kind of operationalizing art's progressive potential. And once again, these are the sort of discourses that started kind of circulating around 2012. And I think they came very much together actually with this uneasy confrontation between artworks that were claiming to be bringing into purview some sort of emancipatory agenda, and simultaneously those artworks being hosted by institutions that were funded by less than, let's say, kind of emancipatory minded entities, whether these are like, various corporations with kind of aggressively predatory interests in not particularly socially friendly fields like exploitation of various natural resources, et cetera, or whether it's the individuals, kind of high net worth individuals, particularly from the new capitalistic, relatively new kind of capitalistic societies. And I think that schism was very important in kind of highlighting how maybe the critical gesture of the artwork wasn't really working, or at least the way it was operating wasn't really the way that it was setting itself out to operate. So, and there was, I think, an interest within this moment in 2012 to rethink critique and to actually think, are there different modes of doing ultimately critique, although it was more like, you know, let's just move away from critique, because critique is already complicit with existing like kind of late capitalist power structures. Let's find a different mode of operating in the art field. And so these three kind of this sort of three overall themes frame kind of the context of this research. Let me just, sorry, tell my son to be quiet because this is really frustrating. 1 second. Sorry. Okay. So let me just. How do I switch my slide? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I just wanted to change the slide. Okay. Sorry, guys. I am usually a little bit more tech savvy, but my brain is a bit dead. Okay, here. Right. So the directions, I mean, this kind of resonate with the contextual setting of the research. Kind of the first one, TA system, it's sort of then kind of rewrite the ontology of contemporary art from the perspective of this theoretical blind spot between economic value and infrastructural value, so to speak, and aesthetic, cultural, ethical, political. Then sort of the second intention of the research was to, or is still, to kind of to reprogram art as an instrument. And now, I mean, these words, this kind of statement would offend a lot of people in contemporary art. And I think the reason it would offend a lot of people is precisely the reason why I am kind of working on this project of rewriting the ontology of contemporary art, because ultimately I would argue that art has always been an instrument, and art is always an instrument, and that actually we need to think what instrumentality can allow for in order to kind of get out of this cul-de-sac, out of sort of dead end of thinking that anything that's that anything instrumental is ultimately inherently capitalistic. And there's a lot of work, and I think some of this work we have referred to in our previous course, for example, like Luciana Parisi's work around computation, the incomputable, that is also that is also sort of doing this more kind of deep-founded philosophical rewriting of Western ontological accounts in order to kind of deviate from this very standard critique of technology as something that always is complicit with capitalism, and as techne as instrument that is also always complicit with capitalism. So, but in order to do that, I think in order to rewrite that ontology, what's important to understand is actually kind of the ordering logics of some of the instruments that have ordered societies, at least since the advent of industrial revolution, and obviously with the kind of with the dynamics that we're seeing today. So what I will cover today is I will try to explain in greater detail why I find this kind of problem of art's value schism between infrastructural and ethical, political, and aesthetic to be a problem, and how we need to move towards reconciling that schism in order to ultimately maybe even move towards a different art paradigm. And this is an argument that resonates with Suhail Malik, from whom I kind of borrow a lot in my work, and his thesis on the necessity for art's exit from contemporary art, which is a book that will sometime come out in the future. It's been promised for the last 4 years, but hopefully it'll come out in 2016. And then the second thing that I will cover is I will sort of give you an overview of how financialization of art is usually depicted within standard discourse, and try to show how maybe, although that that explanation is it's valid on the terms that it establishes, but what I'm questioning are the terms that it establishes, and that slightly kind of abstract formulation will become clear, hopefully. If not, please do make me accountable to that and ask me questions. And then the third thing that I want to cover is obviously what the very subject matter of this course is going to be, and it's a potential for kind of better sociocultural readings, it should be an S, sorry guys, of contemporarization, what I call, and financialization as coextensive phenomena. And so this is very much a question. I mean, I as you will see, I am still in the process of working this out. And so I'd like to have a discussion around this. And I guess the kind of the case studies of the consequence sessions are very much about trying to look at the specific terms of what these sociocultural readings could entail and how they could then be thought of as a mode of reprogramming art as an instrument. Okay, so then let's move to point one. So value. I mean, I guess here I've got a set of terms which I think very much kind of resonate with the most typical associations that we have in contemporary art with what kind of art's value entails. And of course, there's the kind of historical philosophical tradition of transcendental conceptions of art, and its kind of manifestation in the aesthetic judgment and the sublime. So kind of both of these notions are very much rooted with the kind of romanticist tradition, German romanticism, and of course in Kantian philosophy. And I think the kind of the hangover of the Kantian philosophy, although it's something that a lot of art practices, or like, let's say, a lot of art movements have taken up to deconstruct it, to move beyond, especially in the latter half of the 20th century. I feel it's something that has such deep roots that it has kind of this kind of recalcitrant presence, despite the fact that there might be active denunciation of that heritage. And I think in a very similar way, the notion of art's autonomy kind of operates in a very similar way. So the notion of art's autonomy, I think, is very core to modernist conceptions of art. And yet, let's say, kind of the transition from modernism into what we now know contemporary art is one that kind of hyperbolizes the negation of modernism, the very basis of kind of the modernist tradition, but simultaneously it tends to smuggle back in the kind of notion of art's autonomy in order to elevate or to separate art from the rest of social processes. And there are a lot, there's a lot of back and forth about that in art history. So I think kind of the standard kind of go-to tug of war between kind of autonomous art and art that's kind of integrated and sort of part of societal purposes is sort of this opposition between Adornian conception of art's autonomy, that in order for art to retain its kind of critical potential, it needs to necessarily kind of claim its autonomous position, and the Brechtian, Bertolt Brecht's approach to art as something that is a manifestation of social process, that is in itself kind of if not a representation, but sort of the active breath of society, and needs to be necessarily thought of and practiced as such. And then the kind of the Heideggerian also hangover, Heideggerian and phenomenological also hangover of considering art from the position of the non-instrumental. So unlike all other processes within society, and particularly kind of directly capitalistic processes, where instrumentalization is the kind of primary modus operandi of those systems, what distinguishes art, it's sort of its non-instrumental nature, kind of essence, ultimately. And I guess this is where this is the reading that I would like to most resist, not necessarily by just sort of fully debunking it, but I think for kind of historically contextualizing it not just in terms of art history, but also in terms of the development of societal systems that I think make this reading ultimately untenable and unproductive in current conditions. So I just wanted to very quickly kind of retrace the art historical trajectory that I find most relevant in situating, let's say, this particular approach to contemporary arts and art's value today. And so I guess this, this sort of the standard narrative of contemporary art, it ultimately starts in the kind of modernist tradition of negation. And so here we've got Gustave Courbet's very kind of infamous painting called Les Baigneurs, or I think Baigneurs, the bathers, which he which was rejected, which he submitted to the Paris Salon in 1855, but the work was rejected. And just for those who are not very, I mean, I'm also not an art historian, so I apologize if this is like a sort of bastardization of art history, but I think I've got the facts right. So obviously the Paris Salon was a very important kind of art institution, and then kind of modernism started defining itself in mid to late 19th century in terms of kind of rejecting that institutional setting. So that the rejection kind of happened slowly. So for example, if in 1852 Paris Salon, Courbet's work still, it's not this work, it's another work, was still accepted, then in 1855 this particular work was rejected because kind of the sort of profanity of its content, as long as it was rejected along with 2/3 of artworks that were submitted by artists to the Paris Salon. So instead, this work became part, along with the 2/3 of the ones that were rejected, became part of the so-called Salon des Refusés. And I guess that's a very important kind of like counter-institution within the modernist narrative, that in itself became kind of became eventually towards the end of the 19th century the hegemonic institutional art form. But what to me is really interesting here is the institutional setting, right? So although obviously the kind of the rejection of the work was based on its content and was very much in line with the kind of aesthetic criteria that did not coalesce with aesthetic stipulations of the Paris Salon, the decision that ultimately allowed for this kind of new, let's say, evolutionary branch of artistic tradition, of modernism, was an institutional decision. And there's something very, very important in that for me, because I think it tends to be left as sort of as a background cause, as something like as a sort of happy coincidence because ultimately we like modernism, we like the fact that modernism led us out to this kind of repressed reality of the Paris Salon. But this is really crucial. And just below that, I've done a really kind of crass thing, and I've sort of kind of recontextualized the Baigneur or Gustave Courbet back in the present moment. And so below you have, basically I went to this website called artprice.com, where you can, if you've got an account, if you pay for subscription, you can access auction records. And so yeah, so basically just kind of, this is sort of the crass way of showing how the kind of the work is then recontextualized into the present moment. And instead of like just saying, oh, how terrible, like, this sort of this incredible tradition has been sort of financialized through technological evolution and through kind of processes of financial subjugation of all things that are valuable in art. I would like to put that under question, and I think that question will emerge a bit clearly as I go along. But for now, I just want you to take this as the kind of crass confrontation between these two value regimes, which I feel requires a much more contextual and I think historically situated, but also kind of ontologically rethought explanation. So along similar lines, this is a work by Edouard Manet. Also, I think that it was rejected in that infamous 1855 Paris Salon. And I guess what's important here then is not so much the Manet, but then the reinscription of Manet into the present conditions. So the kind of the two images or text-based images that I have here on the left, which is the caption for the image. It's taken from a platform called Artsy. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I urge you to check it out. For those of you who are familiar with it, you know how Artsy is this really interesting player that has emerged in the last couple of years. And basically, they kind of define themselves as a tech startup that is bringing kind of global art audiences closer to each other and ultimately kind of democratizing, this is how they brand themselves, democratizing access to art in every sense of the word access. So whether you want to, whether you want to actually pair up with an in-house artist specialist who has access to vast art market demand data and will help to find a new home for your artwork, obviously this is particular kind of access, or if you're, let's say, a gallery, a kind of a slightly kind of regional gallery somewhere in the Midwest, maybe a very local gallery that wants to benefit from the kind of client base that more metropolitan and more kind of urban centers have, then Artsy is the place to go to because they ultimately cross-pollinate audiences, at least that's what they claim. They amplify the existing activities of galleries, and simultaneously they offer kind of this sort of an educational knowledge base by pulling together various kind of databases on art movements, trends, past and present, et cetera, et cetera. So I think art is a really interesting, it's a really interesting example actually of this sort of convergence of all of these very different value regimes into this one paella, where the immediate reaction is to be like, oh my God, this is horrible, right? This is just sort of kind of complete denunciation of art's value if understood kind of on these terms. Yet simultaneously, I think it tells us something about conditions of art as something that are not just conditions, but that are perhaps today entering into the sphere of being kind of the primary constituent elements of what art is. Then going within this trajectory of kind of modernist negation, I guess the most infamous work in terms of negating pre-existing criteria for what art can be is Duchamp's Fountain, the Urinal, which has sort of a similarly kind of institutional kind of history, similar institutional history in the sense that it was rejected or it was not allowed to be shown as part of the first annual show, the Society of Independent Artists in New York in 1917. And what's really interesting also, like I quite love institutional administrative details. So what's interesting about the Society of Independent Artists is ultimately artists submitted artworks, but they paid a fee for submission. So in a sense, not getting accepted was kind of hard, but this work was was too scandalous to be submitted because it felt like he was just basically taking a piss in the very direct sense of that word, Duchamp. And but what it allowed for was the rejection. What it allowed for was actually for creation of like quite a sensational moment around this rejection, when Alfred Stieglitz, who at that point was like a very influential character in New York's art world, exhibited the work in his gallery, and also dedicated part of the second issue of the Blind Man publication to the rejection of the of the fountain of Duchamp's work, and kind of critique the kind of conservative reactionary stance of the board of the Society of Independent Artists, of which actually Duchamp was a part, but he resigned from it when the work was rejected, saying that they did not recognize that this work was creating new thought for that object. And I guess these words, kind of creating new thought for the object, are sort of very important. And I guess the sort of note below is that in 1991, one of the replicas of the fountain was sold for kind of the record price of $1.7 million at Sotheby's. And this is an article in The Economist which discusses this particular fact. Now, this particular kind of genealogy, and so I think in many ways the fountain functions as a sort of model for the contemporary art regime that will kind of emerge with conceptualism. But the reason it functions as a model is because it ultimately kind of states that there's a complete evacuation of internally existing criteria for what art can be. And ultimately, art is what an artist says it is. So it's ultimately about the artist's inscriptions of whatever object, of whatever material foundation, into the semantic field of art. So it's sort of the semantic kind of translation from everyday use into an art object, and the kind of the sort of the evacuation of internally set criteria is something that John Roberts argues to be kind of a product of the de-skilling kind of impetus of the modernist legacy, as kind of shown with Courbet, Manet, and their contemporaries, and that the ready-made, in a sense, becomes that kind of hyperbolic form of that historical heritage, and ultimately kind of basically just moves the kind of development of consequent evolution of art into a different register. I highly recommend actually John Roberts' book, because I think, if you don't know it already, I think it makes a very good argument about kind of the function of dematerialization and the importance of kind of dematerialization and de-skilling. And by dematerialization, I mean the kind of the understanding that materials are not subjugated, are subjugated to ideas rather than subjugated to their functional role, as the very kind of basis of conceptual art and then of contemporary art. And as I said, conceptual art, I think, is sort of, it's kind of the next stop. You know, I'm making a lot of jumps, but I think conceptual is very, very important because it sort of picks up this Duchampian anarchism, ontological anarchism, and it really builds a new paradigm on the basis of that initial ontological anarchism. And conceptual art becomes and by conceptual art, I mean everything that sort of happens, not everything, but a lot of things that happen after 1960s, 1970s, and which are also kind of labeled under the kind of first wave of institutional critique, minimalism. And what's interesting about those practices is the fact that on the one hand, they reject the kind of the sort of transcendentally based explanations of art's value, the ones that we kind of saw in the very beginning, and instead they focus on creating a juxtaposition towards existing conditions. So in a sense, they sort of flatten out art's temporality to a certain extent, and start sort of differentiating the art, non-art difference becomes sort of a semantic difference. So ultimately, what art starts doing is looking out into wider reality, understanding the semantic composition of that reality, reshaping that semantic composition, and by producing an art object that is placed in space, or that is not maybe an art object, that is a performance, or that is just a conceptual work, that, I don't know, that is a set of instructions, whatever, it becomes a way of juxtaposing the sort of the difference between this reformulated semantic reality, existing semantic reality, and that kind of difference is what I would argue the very kind of basis of critique, as it becomes kind of the dominant modus operandi of understanding what art does. So the critical gesture, I guess, then operates both as a sort of this very kind of schematic way of distinguishing art from its surroundings. But then the critical gesture also has a very important resonance with philosophical, or theoretical, I should rather say, traditions that are developing within this period of time. This is sort of the development, evolution of post-structuralist thought. And I guess what's very foundational to post-structuralism is, well, its investment into language, and actually kind of understanding the constructive powers of language, and ultimately the deconstructive power of kind of political emancipatory projects, or the fact that deconstruction in itself becomes a form of critique, a form of political statement, and so there is sort of a symmetry then between various branches of conceptual practices, the kind of emancipatory agendas that they were interested in deconstruction as ultimately a mode through which, a sort of a logic through which they not only fashion their critique of existing realities, circumstances, but also the manner in which they thought of semantically reorganizing reality and funneling that semantic reorganization into an art object being understood, as I said, not just as an object, but whatever the artwork would be. I deviated a little bit, but here I've got a book by Albero, art after conceptual art. So I this thesis that conceptual art is a really important ground zero in our understandings of contemporary art is quite typical. That's nothing extraordinary, but I guess different theorists kind of have different approaches to what that ground zero actually means. Albero's approach, I think, is very sort of art historically grounded, and I thought it would be just quite interesting to also sort of as this kind of commitment to showing the crass, crude juxtaposition between the development of intellectual and kind of artistic discourse together with the sort of development of infrastructural realities. So here there's an efflux ad or efflux kind of information newsletter thing that states that the Generali Foundation, which is it's based in Austria, but I'm not entirely sure if it's entirely Austrian. I think it is Austrian, yeah. Has one of the largest conceptual art collections, and that it's basically giving its collection on a permanent loan to Museum der Moderne in Salzburg. And here below, we've got what is Generali. So the Generali Foundation is obviously the non-profit wing of Generali, which is a major player in the global insurance industry, a strategic and highly important sector for the growth, development, and welfare of modern societies. Right. So once again, like, how do we account for this beyond this just crude rejection of the complicity or of these things actually being, within the same room, quite bluntly speaking. And just out of interest of kind of pegging this slightly abstract explanation of why conceptual art, post-structural theory, deconstruction, critique are in a sense, converging in many ways. I just chose a work from the Generali collection, which I think illustrates that quite well. It's Adrian Piper's Catalysis 4, and of course, Adrian Piper's work was very much kind of invested in undoing, but also sort of the kind of oppressive regimes associated with the African American subject position in the U.S. And yeah, it's one of her performances. So now I wanted to talk about Peter Osborne's work, in part because for two reasons. I mean, first of all, this book, Anywhere Not at All, which was published quite recently, in the last couple of years. It is probably the first kind of systematic account that is invested in trying to understand contemporary art from an ontological perspective. Another such approach is Suhail Malik's, but he has not yet published his book, so I'm not going to talk about it. But still, I think Osborne is very important because I think the way that he situates and diagnoses actually why he is actually one of the first people ultimately to try to figure out what the ontology of contemporary art is because he points to the 1980s as a period where this kind of deconstructive tendency of post-structuralism and the increasing heterogeneity of conceptual art-inspired practices or contemporary practices had morphed into this sort of flattening out, complete sort of detachment from any common denominator that we know as postmodernism, right? And like, I guess postmodernism becomes a sort of a very kind of crude, horrible mutation of the very kind of politically and intellectually charged post-structuralist thought. And in a sense, I feel like the 1980s with a kind of this postmodern turn, in many ways, we're kind of going through maybe a similar period right now, where there's evidently like a mutation of this neoliberal norm that we had occupied at least for the last 10 years, and somehow there's just there's a mutation of this neoliberal norm, and potentially there is something either super gloomy that's going to show itself in the next couple of years, or we don't know. But I guess in the 1980s context, what was interesting is that it was this period that was kind of this last stage of a global political order that was based on this binary division between the capitalists and the communists, and obviously this binary division falls apart in the early 1990s, and that's when we have this kind of onset of globalization. And so the postmodern kind of merges into global, but the global claims to no longer be the postmodern. So the global kind of is very much posits itself as sort of as interconnectedness that is respectful of difference, and that isn't about kind of flattening out all difference into this kind of relativistic everything goes, but that ultimately kind of that it is difference that unifies us, and this sort of emphasis on difference as the ordering mechanism of the global and kind of the neoliberal global, ultimately something that I discussed in the previous course when I was talking about how, let's say, in terms of liberal traditions, the neoliberal tradition emphasizes difference and emphasizes the market as the platform upon which difference can be secured, and how that kind of paradigm is ultimately reflected within the contemporary art sphere. And then sort of the other liberal trajectory was the human rights trajectory, where actually what makes us the same is this abstractable unit called the global human subject, and how that ultimately does no longer works, like really in the 90s when the human rights regime is attempting to get off the ground, but never really kind of never really gets anywhere in terms of global significance and global ordering power. So with Osborne's book, so he kind of contextualizes the postmodern break as the reason why art theory and philosophy of art had been evacuated of any kind of ontologically driven analyses. But also the postmodern becomes like this break that kind of separates the period between 1960s and 1980s, where theorization of new art practices was still sort of coded by art historians who were critics who were most of the time art historians, and it was still inscribed into certain groupings according to some sort of kind of either medium-based, but usually not even medium-based, or at least kind of thought-based criteria that distinguish them from one another. You know, whether it's arte povera, minimalism, etc. So, but whereas in the 1990s, what he argues is that the globalization kind of drive of a no longer kind of bipolar world, or a world that has to quote Fukuyama, has now kind of embraced this kind of unipolar end of history, is really the kind of the point where the heterogeneity of art becomes defined through its relationship to the global. And so, so for Osborne, globalization is really kind of the coming of conscience moment of contemporary art. And also, contemporary art for him is always inherently post-conceptual art, in the sense that it kind of takes the conceptual paradigm and it sort of normativizes it. So the post is not so much about getting over conceptual art, but actually taking the premises of conceptual art as the very foundation of this new global art. And then the third criterion is the criterion of temporality, contemporaneity, being the new sort of definitive aspect, or definition, the defining aspect of contemporary art in terms of how it relates to its time. So relating to its own time becomes, in a sense, like a criterion that Osborne attaches to this ontological account of contemporary art. And yeah, so here are the three concepts. What's important, I guess, what's important to note about Osborne's work is that he's sort of trying to reclaim aspects of the Adornian project. He really doesn't like postmodernism. He's not really sure about globalization either, so he's very he recognizes all the kind of negative effects of globalization within the standard that are very typical, kind of eradication of difference, etc. And I guess it is here within this sort of ambivalence between globalization as something that is ultimately kind of aggressive, driven by hegemonic capitalist formations, is all about kind of corporate standardization, although it claims to have some sort of respect for the local, but the local ultimately becomes like a fetishistic just moment within the rebranding of what were previously just basically places. But at the same time, I think he tries to he sort of tries to redeem contemporary art as something that can actually, if not preserve, I don't think he's interested in project preservation of difference, but because of its sort of conceptual background, because of its sort of post-conceptual nature, has the capacity to inflect or reflect these contemporary conditions in a critical manner. So I think ultimately he wants to get away from using the terms like critique, but I think this still remains a very important aspect of why he feels contemporary art is important. By the same token, he feels that the art historical historical accounts that still dominated theorization of art between the 60s and 80s can no longer really fully account for what's happening in the field of art because of the heterogeneity, because of this constant reference to external fields which have their own specific knowledge domains. So this kind of transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity become very important aspects for him of kind of reinvesting into philosophical accounts that take this new domain of knowledge production. I mean, for academia, it's new, transdisciplinary knowledge production as the very basis of their operations. And of course, because he's a philosopher, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting him by saying he's an Adornian philosopher, he is interested in ontologically grounded art criticism that is capable of providing this transdisciplinary kind of narrativization or ontological grounding of contemporary art. And I think Osborne's work, in many ways, I feel it's very important work, in part because I can really sympathize with his drive to understand the kind of, to get to the ontological basis of contemporary art, and to not take this kind of postmodern front of, oh, it's all just difference floating around us in the world. As a deviation from, or as just a rejection of an ontological project. I think it's also useful because he, in a sense, he boxes, he puts contemporary art in a box. And I think not many people have done that. So if you look, for example, at one of the first issues, or maybe the very first issue of Efflux, where Hal Foster sent out a questionnaire to various people, various critics, curators studying the contemporary art world, with the question, what is contemporary art? The kind of, the answers that one gets from that survey is that sort of contemporary art is everything, and that's a little bit problematic, but at the same time we should not confine it, because confinement is ultimately overdetermination is violence, contemporary art is not violence. So so in a sense, what's good, interesting about Osborne is that he says that that's not correct, that contemporary art does have a certain place, a certain historical trajectory. It's not just everything art of the time until forever. It has a very specific logic of operation, and that logic of operation is grounded in conceptual art. So that's useful. At the same time, I think for me, what he doesn't get to, or at least his ontological starting point, is still the art object. And I think that's problematic. And I think although he recognizes the importance of transforming conditions, so that's very much evident in his kind of emphasis on globalization in this book, but simultaneously he still wants to retain these conditions as just conditions rather than co-constitutive elements. He is effectively also responding to Thierry Dedoux's work that was published, I think, in 1996, called Kant After Duchamp. And I mean, it's an interesting read, but I guess that work, and it kind of takes, it's sort of like postmodernism times Kantianism on crack, because it ultimately tries to kind of create sort of a theory of the aesthetic without the judgment, and ultimately to take the moment of kind of Duchamp's statement that art is what an artist says as a model for saying that art is what a person feels as art. And I mean, he gets into a lot of like weird and sort of logical problems, is like, if the aesthetic then becomes so deeply subjective, then how can you even create sort of a general category of art? But then he gets over it by saying that art is, I think, a proper name, or was it, yeah, a proper name. So it's a strange argument, and I feel that Osborne he's responding to the sort of ontological incoherence of Duduve. But Duduve also is responding to something. So Duduve was responding to Bourdieu, whom I mentioned in the very beginning. And Duduve is trying to resurrect autonomy and to resurrect kind of the sublime from the attack of the newly emerging field of sociology as this kind of then kind of trendy way of theorizing power relations after the kind of the failing of Marxism, in a sense. And Duduve is very opposed to this kind of understanding of art as a social product, which is basically one of the main theses of Pierre Bourdieu's work. But I think Pierre Bourdieu's work, as I said, for me, it's incredibly influential and very important. But equally as important, I would say, is the work of philosopher and sociologist Georg Simmel in the book Philosophy of Money, where he talks about the role of exchange in value creation, or in sort of in determining value. And I guess this sort of alignment between the moment of exchange and the kind of conditions that determine exchange and value is something that is particularly resonant with the way that art works. And I think the kind of the fear of actually looking at exchange because of its very kind of economic connotations has led to this sort of alienation that I was referring to in the very beginning of exchange as something that's just only inherently economic. But in fact, exchange as an inherently social process is something that has been highlighted and expanded on in beautiful, beautiful way in the work of Arjuna Padiroy, who's an anthropologist. This book called The Social Life of Things, Commodities and Cultural Perspective, where he takes the cue from Georg Simmel of kind of looking at the moment of exchange and the kind of value regimes that come into view within that moment, by amplifying it through the various anthropological research, where he looks at sort of non-capitalist societies and the kind of value regimes that become apparent through this moment of exchange. And so these two authors ultimately kind of offer kind of an inspiration or a starting point for bringing this kind of value schism that I have outlined in the very beginning of this talk together. And I feel that contrary to the kind of evolutionary trajectory of art that I've given you up until this moment, there are also certain practices, particularly within the conceptual art tradition, that were specifically trying to do that. And I think one of the most kind of significant contributions of thinking art on systemic terms, and thinking art as something that is not just about what the object says, but how how ultimately various various registers of value creation and semantic and economic and cultural creation are kind of I triggered is evident in the work of Jack Burnham, and particularly his Systems Aesthetics Manifesto, which I think it was published in 1968 in Art Forum. And I was very much influenced by the kind of cybernetic revolution, the introduction of mass technology of dissemination, transformations in the world of media as a result of technological innovation, and his understanding that we're kind of entering an information-driven era that is going to be increasingly technologically mediated. And that ultimately, within this context of technological mediation, this emphasis on the object form no longer made sense. And for him, therefore, art had to become a frontier where we needed to rethink how the transition from object form to systems form would take place. So I will just read out these two quotes because I think they're very important, kind of, and best way of actually summarizing his project. So, in the past, our technologically conceived artifacts structured living patterns. We're now in transition from an object-oriented to systems-oriented culture. Here, change emanates not from things, but from the way things are done. The priorities of the present age revolve around the problems of organization. A systems viewpoint is focused on the creation of stable, ongoing relationships between organic and non-organic systems, be these neighborhoods, industrial complexes, farms, transportation systems, information centers, recreation centers, or any of the other matrices of human activity. In advanced technological culture, the most important artist best succeeds by liquidating his position vis-a-vis society. The significant artist strives to reduce the technical and psychical distance between his artistic output and the productive means of society. Duchamp, Warhol, and Robert Morris are similarly directed in this respect. Gradually, the strategy transforms artistic and technological decision-making into a single activity. At least it presents an alternative in inescapable terms. Scientists and technicians are not converted into artists, rather the artist becomes a symptom of the schism between art and techniques. Progressively, the need to make ultra-sensitive judgments as to the uses of technology and scientific information becomes art in the most literal sense. In a very very similar project to this was also sort of started in the UK by John Letham and his partner. Forget her first name. Her surname was Stephanie. They created this collective called the Artist Placement Group, APG, which wants to collaborate with different industrial and kind of business sectors in offering placements for artists within the productive realm. And so what they were really interested in doing is actually rethinking how the artist was an important, let's say, foil or counter figure, but simultaneously vehicle for driving the rapid organizational and technological evolution of post-Second World War societies. And so I think this is a picture from APG Multinational Forum in Vienna, where they were precisely discussing this question of the role of the artist as as a vehicle of evolution of organizations. And the project APG fell apart ultimately very quickly, actually, in part because it was very difficult to organize these what now would be called residencies within the productive sphere, and to ultimately make the artist part of the organizational process. And so I think the archives are quite fascinating because not even in terms of showing the successes, but also showing the stumbling blocks that they had to face. But I think as an experimentation, as an experimental approach to this more integrated understanding of the role of art within a quickly evolving social context, this is quite a good example. Now this, I don't know, maybe people recognize the figure here. It's Yves Klein, I think, spreading gold into the Seine. And this is like a very French version of the other two, slightly more dry, let's say, approaches to integrative understanding of art's value. And Yves Klein had this work called Zone de Sensibilité. And basically, I think what he was offering were certificates of ownership of empty space. And then this certificates of ownership would be bought in gold by collectors, and then afterwards they would go to the Seine with the collector, also with a curator and a critic who would write about the happening, and half of the gold would be thrown into the river. as I said, this is sort of this is a much more kind of French take on the process. Now, kind of coming back to the American context, so this is the Artist's Reserved Rights Transfer and Sale Agreement, which was a contract that was put together by Seth Siegelaub and a lawyer, Bob Pringansky. Seth Siegelaub was a really important figure in the development of conceptual art practices and just the New York art scene of the 1960s and 1970s. He kind of functioned as a dealer, as a curator, also as an artist, later as a tapestry collector. I mean, he was quite an interesting character. But this resale rights agreement was something that he wanted his friends and colleagues, the newly kind of baked artists who were operating in New York, to integrate into their dealings with galleries and with collectors. And so so the core stipulation, financial stipulation, that 15% of any increase in the value of each work would come back to the artist each time it was resold. And then there were various conditions about artists' rights to be able to trace the resales of the work, to be able to have a say in the conditions of exhibiting the work, etc., etc. Now, this has never taken off the ground, although I believe the artist resale rights exist in certain legislations, jurisdictions. I think Canada is one, and I think there's somewhere else, maybe even France. But one of the biggest problems that this sort of kind of infrastructural modification of the operation of the value regime in art has faced was that often it's very difficult to actually trace provenance and to trace how artworks move from hands to hands for most people. And this kind of places us straight into this larger question about, well, we understand that ultimately between kind of this sort of reality of the previous four examples and the reality that's kind of the dominant reality of today, which is contemporary specific kind of post-conceptual art, a lot has happened. So I think, you know, one of the most important things that has happened is obviously kind of expansion of the art market. And the expansion of the art market was also not just like a direct and sort of trajectory, and has undergone various episodes of development, and also had various models that conflicted with each other, and ultimately have led to a more or less dominant model, which is the model of so-called kind of free market, collector-based free market, and private philanthropy, and sometimes public philanthropy, not philanthropy, public funding. So obviously from the 1970s to 1990s, the expansion of the contemporary art market was driven by New York, and with London and Paris sort of lagging behind. Simultaneously, there was a different model for understanding how artists and how the art field could operate economically, and that was the kind of social democratic model that was operative in Europe, both in Western and Eastern Europe, although obviously on different terms, given that the economic fundamentals were slightly different in both cases. But ultimately, the social democratic model saw the art field as very much part of the public space, which had to be publicly funded. A model that we see kind of starting to fall apart in the 80s. And the model actually that existed in part and was actually quite healthy in the US until the 80s, until the kind of Reagan administration. But simultaneously, I think it's important to know that despite the fact that this sort of more publicly funded model existed, the market model was really the driver of the global paradigm of contemporary art. And the kind of the proliferation of contemporary art museums and biennials and art fairs were kind of part of this global expansion of the market that was obviously driven by certain blue chip clusters, whether urban clusters like London, New York, Paris, or primary market actors, the galleries of these cities. And the rise of the global CA complex then for me is very much integrated with this aspect of kind of market expansion that we need to understand, not just kind of from a critical perspective as this sort of like just kind of unhinged capitalistic drive, but something that behaves slightly different to many other markets for reasons that I will explain in this next part of the talk. But also something that is actively kind of occluded, or at least there are attempts to kind of constantly shy away from the importance of the market expansion by kind of just shitting on it ultimately, and just saying how terrible it is. But then at the same time heavily relying on it because that's the very infrastructural basis of the contemporary art paradigm. So it's this kind of value schism that to me feels quite solipsistic and actually in need of a resolution, which is why I think it's really important to rethink the very ontology of value. Now, there are two approaches to the art market in the contemporary art speak world. One is the kind of neoclassical, and by neoclassical it's going to be reference to neoclassical economics, which is very much based on kind of abstracted units through which the economy is defined, and on idealized conditions of perfect competition, market equilibrium, rational actors, etc. And the market is always somehow kind of this sort of idealized domain of economic exchange. And then the socioculturally integrated account, which resonates a lot with various heterodox economic accounts, and that kind of uses different ways of understanding the market, ways that are usually much more sort of historically, socially, institutionally, politically, culturally embedded. The contemporary art way of understanding the art market is the first one. It's the neoclassical. So it's the art market is something that kind of sits within, but simultaneously outside of what contemporary art is. And this is this kind of approach to, or critique of this approach is most interesting, I think, developed by Suhail Malik. And the basics of his argument are that in general in contemporary art, market needs to be kept separate in order for contemporary art to retain its ethico-political value, so the purity of its ethico-political value. I don't know why that says that here. At the same time, given the importance of exchange within contemporary art, the kind of the exchange, the sort of the sale of work, the kind of commodification and sale of work is both positioned as sort of an uncomfortable reality that is just, we need to kind of work with. It's just something that needs to exist, and simultaneously as a sort of a virtuous ethico-political act on the part of the collector. So the collector always needs to have kind of good intentions, love for art, in order to participate within this exchange. And this love for art argument is something that Suhail develops really well, and I think it's absolutely brilliant because it's absolutely true. So if we look, let's say, at the recent scandals around the practice of flipping, which is basically kind of actors who are not interested in art for art's value, ethico-political value, but just as commodity objects that can appreciate in value through exchange. And therefore, what's possible is to orchestrate a series of resales in order to boost the value of a certain work of art. Now, that has been kind of completely branded as like rogue practice, terrible. This is not the kind of exchange that we want. And it was really interesting to kind of observe the ethical arguments around that. Around the scandal, because this practice of heating up prices through resale is actually something that both auction houses and primary market actors engage in all the time, right? So there's this like conflicting notions of what exchange, of what value regimes exchange can amplify, and what value regimes need to remain somehow repressed. And what allows, I think, for that schism, conflict, inconsistency to continue operating is ultimately the opacity of the contemporary art market. And when we talk about the opacity, we mean opacity of valuation, of price setting, of how artworks, of how prices for artworks are configured, and opacity at the level of transaction, so the level of sale. And says that, you know, primary market actors, galleries, primary market dealers, they do not need to register their sales anywhere. These are not in public record. The only records that we have of sales are from secondary market, and you know, we have various kind of data analytics that are being pushed forward by different kind of techie-driven platforms, but these are very suspect because it's not really clear where they're getting their data from. So ultimately, kind of opacity becomes kind of the stronghold of the contemporary art market actors. So let me just pause for a second. So, but I think what's been really interesting over the last 10 years is, once again, sort of the sociological interest in the contemporary art market. And one of the most renowned figures in this respect, one of the sociologists who have rationalized the contemporary art market and actually pushed towards us thinking the contemporary art market as something that's integrated into the socio-institutional complex of contemporary art, as something that is sitting outside of it, is Olaf Veldhuis. And Olaf Veldhuis wrote this fantastic book called Talking Prices, but then he also has an essay together with Erica Kostler in the Sociology of Finance book, which specifically kind of deals with this question of the financialization of art. He doesn't just deal with contemporary art, he deals with art in general, and that's an interesting distinction, because obviously a lot of let's say kind of old masters and modern artworks are by now what are known as blue chip artworks, which means that their value is pretty, their financial value is pretty secure. They're not particularly risky assets, and as we can see in the kind of auction house prices for various, like for whatever Cézanne's or I don't know, whoever really of that kind of stature, these are very safe investment assets. Now, for contemporary art, it's a little bit different. Contemporary art is still considered to be a bit of a much riskier asset, specifically because of the kind of opacity that surrounds valuation. And here I will not kind of read this entire quote in detail. But basically, what Veldhuis and Kostler argue is that when we think about financialization of art, what's important to consider is, first of all, that historically art objects have always been stores of financial value. And that's something that has been practiced, you know, from Renaissance, at least from the Renaissance onwards. And as sort of stores of value, they would become important in moments of, let's say, currency inflation for obvious reasons. But at the same time, let's say, in moments of political and social unrest and turbulence and transitory periods, they would be, let's say, decreased interest in artworks as storages of value, as investment vehicles. Simultaneously, let's say in the 1920s, with the development of basic fund structures, we also see the emergence of art funds, very simple art funds. I mean, these art funds are generally quite small scale and only kind of accessible to very small urban elites of very kind of particular Western cities. But nonetheless, there is this kind of experimentation. However, you know, within sort of 1960s and kind of the emergence of conceptual art, the stranger that art got, the more risky it became as an asset. Simultaneously, what's with kind of it also becomes clear that while art has become riskier as an asset, it also serves as a good, what's called kind of beta. It has a low beta coefficient, which means it doesn't follow the same direction of market trends as, let's say, other assets. So in terms of diversifying financial portfolios, it does have a lot of potential, which is one of the reasons why financial institutions are very interested in art and have been attempting to kind of break the opacity of the art market for quite a while. And so in a sense, this kind of the dataization, the kind of the art market, and the need to quantify and to kind of pin down valuation criteria has been sort of one of the drives behind various different projects or kind of business ventures in the art field in the recent years. And one such sort of interesting project is ArtRank. Look into it at spare time. I'm also a bit conscious of time, so I want to kind of speed things up a bit. I mean, ArtRank was a bit of a weird one because it never really fully integrated. So it was trying to provide this kind of consultancy services to collectors, but then it was also sort of pitching itself as kind of as an art project. So it wasn't really sure where it stood, and I don't think it really ever took off as kind of as a serious platform for the kind of financial collecting consultancy work that it seemed to offer. Then there's also different, apart from the art funds, and there are also different financial institutions or financial companies that that provide loans and use art as a collateral on loans. And if formerly the only kind of work that would be accepted as collateral is the kind of blue chip, sort of secure, low risk asset like a Cézanne painting, right? There are new actors emerging which are once again trying to kind of use trends and data analysis as a way of also incorporating more contemporary artworks into this kind of potential pool of assets that could serve as collateral and loans. And so with all of these developments, and then of course there's Deloitte, and the report that I assigned you to read for today from this year is very clear about kind of Deloitte's interest in making the contemporary art market less and less opaque. And here I think the kind of the straightforwardness of their mission is quite laudable. That art is now seen not as only as an object of pleasure, however, also as a new alternative asset class with interesting business opportunities. And it's all of these kind of developments, this sort of incursion of financial logics into the domain of the art field, that Olive Welchhuis and Erica Kostler see as signs of partial financialization of the art field. And partial because ultimately it's still considered to be too opaque to be fully financialized, to be fully driven by by agenda of financial accumulation, of financially driven accumulation. And while I think that this sort of analysis of Welchhuis and Kostler is very accurate, incredibly empirically useful, I feel that the terms on which it is set could be subject to question. And to question those terms is not so much to reject what the kind of the empirical analysis they're offering, but to actually to rethink how we could use the art field as a platform through which financial logics can be modulated, rather than financial logics being this sort of complete totalizing processes that just captivate and subjugate all territory and art territory, including to the capitalistic profit-seeking rationale. And I think then what becomes important is to look at the theories of financialization that exist. And so theories of financialization tend to be separated into sort of sociological accounts, the sociological accounts that are very empirically founded, as most sociology is, and that are sort of very careful about not overstating or like sort of overblowing the importance of certain phenomena, but simultaneously trying to understand how the mechanics of certain phenomena work. And sociology of finance, to that extent, has been a very important field because it provided readings of financialization from a perspective that wasn't just this kind of the neoclassical economic perspective, nor was it just an economic perspective potentially emerging from other heterodox economic schools, but that was still just interested in the particular kind of economic dimension of financialization. So the sociology of finance has the sort of empirical branch, which, as I said, is very important in de-black boxing the field of finance. Yet simultaneously, there's this other wing, which is a little bit less, maybe a bit more, if not speculative, but slightly more, I would call it more speculative. It deviates from this empirical orthodoxy of the sociological approach, and this is the sociocultural readings of the financialization, which I will present in a second. And for me, the most kind of influential thinkers to that extent are Edward Lee, Lee Puma, forgot his first name, and Randy Martin. But first, let's look at the sociological empirically driven accounts. So this is a graph that I've taken from an essay by Greta R. Kittner, The Financialization of the American Economy, that looks at, as you can see, the relative interest shares of corporate profits in US economy from 1950 to 2001. And so you see the kind of the manufacturing industry, the profits that are drawn from manufacturing. Then you see the profits that are drawn from just kind of strict financial services. But then you see the FIRE sector, which is finance, insurance, and real estate, and the profits of that start really kind of rising or starting to kind of peak in the 80s. And then in the kind of late 90s, there's this sort of very drastic separation between the industry, the profits that are made from manufacturing and the profits that are made from financial transactions. And so with this graph, Krippner is basically arguing that what kind of happens in this period and in this kind of post-war period is that there's a cool down within the non-financial proper sector, within this, let's say, corporate sector, there, manufacturing corporate sector, there is a decrease in revenues that accrue from production, and increase of revenues that accrue from engagement in the financial sector. So in a sense, the non-financial sector starts taking up the functions or the business of the financial sector. And this kind of transition from an economy that's the profits of which emerge from kind of sort of standard industrial account of capital accumulation and increase in production, etc., to economy that's driven by profit making through engagement in financial circulation without necessarily a reinvestment into the capital base of production, becomes this kind of very backbone of the various theories of financialization that emerge in the last 20 years. And there are a lot of different characters that I really kind of advise you to look into. I mean, one is Epstein, and he really kind of just really focuses sort of on exactly on this dimension of transition from production to logics of circulation and the structural economic elements of that transition. the Krippner's and I think Epstein's as well, case studies are primarily America-driven. Then Christopher Deutschmann sort of takes Krippner's and Epstein's kind of U.S. economy-based analysis and expands it to the global economy, and argues that these trends are actually maybe perceived in European and also non-European economies. And he also kind of explains financialization in really beautiful ways on sort of three levels: micro, meso, and macro. So sort of at and kind of the macro is what I have just described here. Then kind of the sort of the meso level transformation of the banking system. The key phenomenon to be considered here is the rise of investment banks and the parallel decline of traditional commercial banking, and then the impact on the state and state finances. Then, and the micro level, which when actually Christopher was talking about his father and about kind of himself, that's basically the micro level. It's kind of, it's the sort of self-integration, the integration of the subject into the everyday regime of kind of financial entrepreneurial investment, and actually. And I guess at the very practical level, this is evident in privatization of, let's say, pension schemes, or of education costs, and the fact that it is let's say, the individual who takes on the debt, the private debt, to go to college, as the American system functions. And it's a model that has been kind of exported quite successfully all over the world and is kind of on the rise. Then the rise of the small investor. And just generally sort of the financialization of every aspect of our kind of daily existence. Now, but I feel that one of my issues with a sociological account is that, once again, although it's very, very accurate, it's also highly depressing, and kind of feels like there isn't really much to be done, because it feels that the micro level is so integrated and subjugated to the meso and the structural that ultimately the only kind of systemic change that can happen is at the structural and the meso level, and that the micro level is just, it's ultimately kind of a testing ground for the structural and the meso, but necessarily by figures and structures that are already in power. So ultimately, kind of this kind of scaling up effects of the micro in a context of financialization, especially when it's necessary globalizing force, feel very, doesn't feel like a very promising route. By the same token, I think if we look at the sociocultural analysis of a very particular aspect of I think financialization, and this is the aspect of the futures markets and derivatives, and I'll explain why I was particularly interested in futures market and derivatives in a second. But the work of Lee Puma and Lee in analyzing the ordering logics of derivatives and future markets also show us how these ordering logics are not just confined to the realm of finance, but in fact they are performed and they are present within other domains, and I think specifically within the domain of contemporary art. And so what interested me about the derivative particular is ultimately how the derivatives value it derives its value from its underlying asset, but ultimately, once the derivative starts circulating within the derivative market, or future contracts are circulating within the futures markets, the value of that contract becomes it starts generating value through that circulation, rather than necessarily through its relationship to its underlying. So the underlying just becomes kind of a reference base, as sort of an external reality from which value is extracted. But once it it becomes part of the circulation regime of the derivatives market, the benefits of the value generation within that bond are distributed within the participants of that market. And so for me, that operation where the derivative, in virtue of its semantic capacity to produce, let's say, a kind of another register, another domain of value generation, it's that semantic capacity to translate into value generation, and just is very similar to the way that contemporary art works and contemporary art functions, in the sense that if let's say if we take contemporary, let's say a typical contemporary art object as something that ultimately extracts value or relates, extracts value seems like too much of a judgmental phrasing, but let's say that derives its semantic base from an external reality. Now, once that kind of reconfiguration, semantic configuration has been sort of objectified within a contemporary art work, it enters the economy and the market, the social institutional complex of contemporary art, where its circulation is ultimately what generates its value, and the value that's generated through that circulation is distributed between the market participants. And market participants here, I'd like to define in a very broad way. So the artist is a market participant, the various, let's say, institutions that have both the given value, but also taken certain both symbolic and maybe financial value from showing that work. Then obviously the biggest one is the collector, and this sort of this regime of value circulation is something that on the first glance becomes like a kind of a very horrid, a sort of dark reading of what contemporary art does. But I think on a second glance, when we start looking closer at the logics that are operationalized through that process of value generation, we understand that actually there's a possibility to work with these logics and to actually, let's say, use this capacity of the object and its ability to generate value through circulation and through amplification as a ways of spreading certain maybe revised contractual conditions, maybe embedding different ways of thinking about how the relationship between the object and the value that it generates and the ultimate beneficiaries of that value is construed. Who are the beneficiaries, right? So I feel that the agency of ultimately this very kind of financialized model of the contemporary art regime is indicates that there are ways of working with it. And I guess this is kind of where I am at right now. And there are a couple of different projects that I've engaged in the past and I'm engaging in now. They're looking specifically at this kind of capacity of the artwork as a derivative that can have infrastructural that can have infrastructural effect and consequentiality, and that can ultimately maybe even restructure infrastructures through the value generation that is attached to its circulation. Now, this is super abstract, and I think but I kind of wanted to remain abstract because it's important to think this as a model first before we see the different applications of that models in the various case studies that we'll be looking at. And this is just a book that I highly recommend maybe for everyone to look at. I have already recommended to Christopher in the previous section, but sessions. But it really sort of looks at this potential of derivatives, the kind of the connectivity that derivatives produce, the sort of relationship to the future that they produce, the relationship of value generation today to the future, and also the kind of interdependencies that I necessarily inaugurated through the circulation of derivatives interdependencies that are currently, there's no question about that, currently are directed towards private profit seeking. But these interdependencies can, so the argument goes, can be thought outside of this very strict kind of reductive capitalistic box. And so for me, the question is like, how do we unlock that potential through art ultimately? So yes, so just to kind of quickly go over the case studies. So the next session, which is the 29th of March, we'll have Joao and Erica with us. And they will be talking about actually the contract as that vehicle, contract as artwork and artwork as contract, as a vehicle that could allow for the sort of modulation that I was just describing, and also about blockchain as a technological possibility that can take Seth Sigelaub's artist resale rights sort of model and use the technological possibilities of blockchain in order to maybe revisit and reify that project in the current era. Then session 3 on April 12th will be joined by Alexandra Perici, with whom I'm currently working on a project that tries to think how performance art as ultimately kind of the most direct let's say, correlate of derivatives because of its materiality, but ultimately it's kind of its contractual foundation as an object within the contemporary art field. How performance can function as a derivative that restructures contractual relationships and distribution of value. And just to contextualize that project, the performance that Alexandra has developed when thinking through this question is based on these sculptures called Parthenon marbles, which are currently held by the British Museum, but they're a series of sculptures that were on the Acropolis in Greece, in Athens, until late 18th century. And late 18th century, they were just sort of taken off by British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and taken with him to the UK. So the way that, you know, a lot of these kind of objects from various countries that were subject to colonial and regimes have been obtained. And so now it's in British Museum. There's been this huge scandal, like with a lot of other objects, about repatriating them back to Greece. And then British Museum is saying, no, we are the Universal Museum. We have the right to show them. This is where kind of universal heritage is preserved. But obviously, one of the reasons they need to keep them is ultimately the British Museum is also in the business of offering consultancy services to various other museums across the world, including the developing world. And that kind of those consultancy services are very much predicated on their kind of superior status within the institutional ecology of the cultural, of the museological cultural field. And so the question is then, like, well, if these objects are not just about sort of preserving heritage and sharing that heritage with the general public, but they're also, ultimately, they have this kind of derivative function of accruing value, consultancy-based services value, then why isn't a place like, let's say Acropolis Museum, one of the recipients of this accrued value? And so we're thinking about how this performance that Alexandra has developed, called the Parthenon marbles, will circulate across different institutions, and how the kind of the value that's generated from that circulation can then kind of perform a redistribution. So we'll be talking about that then. And then the final session on the 26th of April is with Emily Rosamond. And Emily looks at another aspect. So if, let's say, with Joao, Eric and Alexandra, we're really much in the realm of derivatives in a certain way, but also kind of contract well, contract-based derivatives, but contracts in a larger sense. Emily is interested in reading socially embedded practices from the perspective of social impact bonds. And social impact bonds have been sort of, it's a financial model that has been developed, I think, by British financial institutions in collaboration with the public sector, with the government, to think how actually private investment can be made into certain social ventures that are kind of necessarily part of the kind of portfolio of things that the government, that the state should be dealing with and taking care of, let's say like prisons or rehabilitation centers, etc., but that have been outsourced to the private sector. But how can this outsourcing also happen in terms where there are positive effects or are somehow embedded into the outsourcing, so that it's not just about, let's say, profit making, but it's also matching profit making, or kind of referencing, pegging profit making to positive outcomes. And so Emily will look at, I find that really fascinating. She will look at how this sort of new triangulation between recipients of public care, in theory, the public sector and the private sector, how this new triangulation allows us to also reread what socially embedded art practices are, and to maybe rethink what socially embedded art practices should be. Right, so I will stop here. Where do I stop? Stop sharing. I will stop here. Oh my God, I totally did not.
Well, we actually still have, I guess, 20 minutes because we started late.
Yeah.
So if people want to respond, let's have.
Yeah, let's please ask me questions, clarifications, responses.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, thank you. There's so much material here. I'm having a hard time collecting my thoughts. So there's so much to digest. I just want to make one clarification, I suppose. I mean, this is probably something that you already know, but the value of a derivative, of course, is not only the function of the price of its underlying asset, but also the rate at which it decays in time.
Yeah, the entropy. Yeah.
Right. I mean, this is implied, of course, in the very word futures. When we buy and sell commodities, we use futures contracts,
Yeah.
which of course expire. For this reason, I think it's important. I mean, derivatives were originally meant for investors who hold large positions,
Yeah.
asset, and want to protect the value of that asset from erosion, loss due to market volatility. And so, I mean, it can be seen, I think, the best analogy that I think I can imagine is that of a term life insurance, right? That is to say, you pay a premium for a time in order to guarantee something.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there's this is not, for the most part, the motivation for market participants. They speculate. In fact, there's been a whole new market called the NADEX, or the binary options markets, that are strictly that are entirely, absolutely dependent on the taste, the speculative taste of a market participant for predicting at a certain point in time what value that asset will have, and then placing bets on that basis. I think it'll be. I think it'll be one of the interesting questions to raise with regard to our subject matter is, what does this do to our notion of value generally? I mean, is value something that can be held or retained, or is it something that is constantly subject to decay?
I think, you know, I'm very happy you brought up this point. I had to do like a big shortcut in the last part because I realized it was going majorly over time. But I think, yeah, it's very important to trace the history of derivatives first towards the kind of the hedging opportunities that in theory, right, derivatives provided to the manufacturing, to manufacturers, or to not just manufacturers, but to whatever, agriculturists, whoever, basically anyone, any sort of business, any sort of production-based market player that wanted to hedge potential risks associated.
Well, they have to guarantee a price, or else it's not worth their production.
Exactly. So then, the ingenuity of the derivatives, I guess, was this kind of the matching up of hedgers and speculators, right? But ultimately, I think what happens, and I think, you know, I would love you to talk more about this because once again, I get it, and I understand it on a very sort of superficial level, but simultaneously, I think there's a lot of kind of very kind of practical, rudimentary information missing from my understanding. So from what I understand, then what happens eventually, especially with increasing kind of technological possibilities for pricing and for kind of the use of Black-Scholes-Merton formula through computational devices, which is the pricing formula for futures and derivatives. It's sorry.
For options, yeah.
Is it for futures and derivatives as well, or just options?
Yeah, I'm not so. I mean, there are options on futures too.
Yeah.
So I think that same formula to determine the price there too.
But from what I understand, ultimately this kind of sort of the modeling, the construction that went in to producing derivatives, futures, options on futures markets, kind of took off a life of its own. And where I guess this is where this graph, I should have shown another graph where basically the volume of derivatives transactions relative to, let's say, the production or relative to the sale of barrels of grain, and the jump that kind of happens between 1990s and 2000s. And that's the interesting part. So I guess here the kind of the analogy is very sloppy, but I think what's interesting, it's like it's ultimately the kind of expansion, the sort of what Lee and Lee Puma call this sort of the striving of financial circulation towards autonomy from the underlying reality. But then Christopher Deutschmann has this really interesting kind of basic point that, but ultimately this kind of autonomy seeking circulation needs to land. And when it lands, this is the 2007, 8, 9 kind of financial crisis. When it lands, then the costs have to be absorbed or have been absorbed socially. Rather than being somehow accounted for in terms of the actors who were complicit. But then this is something we discussed previously, right? How complicity becomes a very difficult thing to pin down because of the complexity of the systems that are involved, and what does tracing actually mean. But this point about value and price I think is incredibly important. Gerald Nestler, who's an artist and who was actually a derivatives trader, but who's an artist who kind of deals with this, with derivatives, and from whom I have taken a lot in my work, he argues that actually what the derivative inaugurates is precisely this kind of entropy, because of this entropic disintegration into price. And so price becomes actually a replacement for value. And so ultimately then the kind of the project of rethinking value is not even a project of rethinking value, but actually of reifying value, of thinking what to do with this sort of entropic disintegration through price setting. and yeah, basically what that would mean, and how and whether that can be done, let's say, through certain kind of synthetically creative art practice.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you to include
Yeah.
the authors and works in a course folder in our
Yes, yeah, totally.
And if anyone does not have access to the Google Classroom already, they can contact me and I'll help them get access.
Very good. I saw there were some sort of comments and stuff. Does anyone want to say anything else?
Can I just add? Well, I mean, I'll give someone else a chance, and then if there's time.
I typed a lot, but I was wondering if anyone else wanted to speak first. Or Christopher, if you want to go ahead and say.
No, I just at a certain point, Victoria, I don't know if it's worth your revisiting this or not, but at the beginning of your presentation, what came to mind was the work of the Marxian critics what's the name of their New School for Social Research, Horkheimer, Adorno, Frankfurt School, yeah. One of the classic values, as you outlined it, of art is that it's non-instrumental, and of course, in their book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno criticizes instrumentalized reason as a legacy of the Enlightenment. And then I also thought about Benjamin's classic essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Mechanical
Product. Yeah,
and I just wondered if, in the context of what you're advocating, or at least exploring right now, how do you respond or address to some of the issues that they raise? I mean, I suppose that they still have valid concerns, of course, even though their work is a child of its own age, so I wonder. I think on the one hand, there's a meaningful distinction to be drawn between shitting on financial communities and capitalism and art markets, and on the other hand, entertaining a healthy suspicion or criticism of them. I wonder, in that respect, whether it's still valuable to read these people.
No, I think it certainly is. I mean, I think it certainly is, because as I said, I think this sort of back and forth between sort of the critical theory branch of the Frankfurt School and the kind of as I said, the Brechtian constructivist, whichever other kind of school of thought on art you want to take, which advocates ultimately the heritage that I align with. It's that sort of back and forth is incredibly important in the history of art, but also in the history of the evolution of kind of political thinking in terms of what emancipatory politics entails. And I think, here I think the kind of, I really, for me, the work that's kind of most important right now is the work that's kind of been done by Luciana Parisi. And we looked at some of her work in the previous session. And her argument is ultimately that within kind of the Frankfurt School, the kind of Horkheimer, Adorno, what they do is they relinquish the possibility of thinking with the instrument. They relinquish the possibility of pragmatist politics that actually understands that the instrument, and in her sense, she's interested in technology and algorithms, etc., has its own agential capacity for evolution beyond the kind of instrumentalization of the human of that instrument. And so for her, what's interesting is to actually think the agency of that instrument outside of the instrumentalization that is subjected on that instrument by whatever capitalist institutions, or by well-meaning artists, or by not well-meaning marketplace, etc. And I think, so for me, the kind of, given the predominance of the sort of Adornian thinking within the contemporary art discourses and kind of understanding of art in general today, my interest is actually in opening up this inquiry of like, what would it mean to think with the instrument if we were to then rewrite the ontology of art? What kind of ontological possibilities for art would that actually, would that produce? So I guess then, to answer your question directly, yes, Adorno and Horkheimer are very important as then being kind of foils as to this inquiry, and sort of yeah, as contrasts to the possibilities that could emerge if the instrument and the agency of the instrument was taken seriously.
Thanks.
Ontological project, is it not creating transcendental objects? No, I think, yeah, well, actually, it's interesting you asked this question. I had this sort of back and forth with a colleague today, which is like, can only happen in the ivory tower of academia, about transcendentalism and immanence, and kind of how ultimately, let's say, Kantian project, it's the wrong kind of transcendentalism, whereas the kind of the Deleuzian project is the one, the project sort of, the Guattari Deleuzian project is the sort of project of immanence, which still believes in ontology. And so I guess that would be the distinction, that like Deleuzian good, Kantian bad.
Yeah, I tried to like sketch out like a really quick syllogism, where it's like art as a distinguished object of transcendental value, then to art as institutional system of socially established values, then to art institutions as cultural byproduct of materialist conditions of capitalism, and then cultural byproducts of materialist conditions of capitalism as the process of X. And I said transcendental yet immanent process, question mark.
Yeah.
I guess
Can you include that in the folder? That looks like one of those nice, like, you know, those graphs that have become very popular with like Keck, all tried. We can put it up instead of the skull, instead of Damien Hirst.
Because I guess
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I know that like it like yeah, it seems like this super heady intellectual problem that has no bearing on reality, and it's just like something we talked about in the ivory tower. But I think like I wouldn't so easily dismiss it as that myself, because the implications seem so great. And then I wonder too if there's like a I mean, I'm also really skeptical personally about these projects of like creating new ontologies, but because I think they are positive projects, I think are potentially really dangerous if they're not like explicitly critical of themselves. And maintaining a criticality of a positive project seems quite almost like
it's difficult. I mean, it's kind of self-canceling, right? I mean,
right.
a certain level, but maybe not. I mean, maybe not. It just, but I think what you're saying is incredibly important because I mean, I think firststly, there are different temporal frames, right? So like, so obviously ontological projects, as we can see with, let's say, whatever Kantianism, has a temporal curve that goes beyond a couple of generations, right? So it's sort of, it kind of, and I think that's one thing that's important to consider, and maybe that's why I am interested in that, because I think one of the problems of this sort of heterogeneity is okay as the foundation of what contemporary art is that it's this tractionless forever present that keeps on reproducing itself and colonizing the future, right? So and that, I think, as a sort of that's just not satisfactory. That's just not cool. And to that extent, I think the Osborne inquiry is important because it really kind of, it sets limits to that, which is what ontological accounts ultimately do. But you're absolutely right that you know, they can. The thing about ontology is that it ultimately it can be re-instrumentalized in ways that you never know, and I guess that's just a risk that one has to take if that's the sort of thing that one is interested in. But once again, coming back to this conversation I had with a friend, I mean, this particular conversation had to do with, I think his project is on kind of it's in Black studies, and it's sort of on kind of developing a non-representational ontology within the Black studies, so kind of taking the Fred Moten route in Black studies. And he was just saying, you know, can you, and I was like, well, you know, this is cool, but I don't quite get how that would help you right now within the current political climate, especially in the US. And he's like, well, imagine if you just went up, you know, to whoever, to whatever institutional setting, and say the fact that, like, Black does not matter. Like, Black doesn't, as in, like, it's not something that actually that should differentiate anything. And so, like, if that's the foundational ontological foundation from which you actually then produce a policy, what will that mean? And I guess what he tried to show me is that, you know, even if we're thinking policy, even if we're thinking specific actions that are particular to our point in time, the ontological presumptions from which we're operating are absolutely paramount. And so I guess this is that's the kind of that's the wager that I'm taking, and also, and I guess investing myself in a particular kind of art practice. It's once again, it connects back to the human rights stuff. It's because ultimately I came into this field thinking this is a better field to do this sort of human rightsy work in, but ultimately understood that it's not at all. And then, so for me, it's always a question like, well, how can it be useful? So the question of use is very, very important, and ultimately the question of use, the question of value. And if we're talking about value, then we need to understand regimes of creation of value, but also what has happened to value ontologically. And this is the thing that Christopher and I were just, you know, talking about, which is this sort of the colonization of the price regime, colonizing kind of the ontology of value creation in societies through the current regime of financialization. And that's the thing we should be critical about. But yeah.
Yeah, I just had just one quick response to it. My immediate thought is that, like, a positive political program that's based in ontology and ends up being really, really similar actually to what I understand is Kant's project, which is like creating the conditions and laws for a utopic world. And like doing that, like the premise of the categorical imperative is that, like, it's you only can do an action if your action could be a maxim, a moral maxim. So I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about, like, dismissing Kant's project entirely, because I think it.
No.
Yeah.
You know, you're absolutely right. I think we can't. I mean, I guess this is, and I guess Kant's notion of critique, and this is something that Luciana has said to me, that I think she's right, where, like, well, you can't just rejected on the grounds in which criticality is rejected in contemporary art. You also need to understand that actually critique within Kant's conception is a positivist project. It's a project actually of movement towards the future. So, so yes, no, let's not completely dismiss Kant.
Right.
Yay.
Cool.
Okay, does anyone else have any comments, questions? Because otherwise I think we should call it a day. It's very late for me and for Chriselle. Okay, very good.
Yeah, I'm totally exhausted at this point.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I hope you'll come back though. But
I will do.
Okay, good. That's good.
Thank you.
4 people is a healthy
Yes.
number. Great, thank you guys so much. And can you send me again the instructions for login?
Yeah. Yes, for the classroom.
Yeah, just so
Yes.
that, because like I'm a bit bad with that. Okay.
Sounds
Right, guys. Have a very good week, and I hope to see you next Wednesday.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay.